Welcome to the Catastrophic Comeback Podcast with American injury lawyer Clark Speaks, helping you find hope, purpose, and joy after a catastrophic injury.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of Catastrophic Comeback. I'm very happy today to have my guest, Scott Rodriguez. Scott is a senior investigator at Speaks Law Firm and has been with us for a long time, has extensive law enforcement and investigative experience. Welcome, Scott. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Clark.
Scott, the first thing I want to talk to you about is in terms of your investigations. This is a podcast designed for people who have suffered catastrophic injuries. So let's focus on your catastrophic injuries and those aspects of your investigations. First of all, what kinds of things do you investigate? How do you contribute? How do you get involved in these kinds of cases?
Specifically to, say, for example, personal injury claims or cases, typically looking from motor vehicle aspects such as crashes, pedestrians, bicyclists hit, looking for where we can find that auto coverage. So spend a lot of time searching through databases, finding vehicles, finding owners. It's a little more complex than, if I find a person has a vehicle and here's auto coverage, insurance coverage. I have to go beyond that because what I have noticed, it's common now. I see people may have, for example, 3 vehicles and may have 3 different insurance policies on there. So I can't just check one box and say, okay, I got their auto insurance coverage. I've got to hit all those vehicles. Then there's just looking for resident relatives policies, for vehicles and an asset. So do a lot of asset searching, be that in person or through databases.
Well, so I thought, I'll be honest with you, I thought we were going to lead with tire impressions and videos and police statements and all that. So you've gone straight into coverage. Let's look at that for a minute. Why is that so important? What do you mean coverage? Why is that important? How does that apply here?
Sure. It's really important on coverages because in North Carolina, we have a minimum requirement for auto insurance coverage. And oftentimes people only have that minimum required coverage. Well, unfortunately, some people's injuries exceed that and well beyond exceed that. So the case managers will ask me to search for other coverage so we can make sure we can help this client financially as a part of their recovery from their injury.
So let's give them a practical impression of how that works. There's a case that comes to my mind right now where a person is on the side of the road changing a tire. Somebody hits them while they're doing that, was negligent, was at fault, had the minimum coverage, $30,000, 30/60, which means 30 per person, 60 per occurrence. So if it's an individual person, the most the insurance company would have to pay is $30,000. If it's a group of people or more than one person, the most they would have to pay is $60,000. So if you cannot find additional coverage, what happens with the balance of that claim? If there's a $1 million loss and there's $30,000 coverage, what happens to that other $970,000 damage?
Well, after that, we have to start looking at the individual and their assets they may have. So if I exhaust my resources looking for auto policy coverage, maybe I find another resident relative and we still can't meet the person's injury, the financial cost of their injury. I start looking for assets, real estate, small business ownership. So I spend a lot of time on the Secretary of State database, seeing if an individual has any small business on their own that might have assets. So I spend a lot of time looking for assets. Some of that time gets into the evidence part of that, of actually going out and camping out in front of a house for a while or camping out in front of a business. Because what I find is with assets, a lot of that stuff isn't recorded anywhere. It's not documented with Secretary of State or insurance or nothing like that. I need to go out there and put eyes on it.
Well, let's talk about some of those individual pieces in just a minute. But if you can't find assets and you can't find coverage, then anything beyond the initial policy, they're just out of luck, right?
It's, for a lack of better words, it almost could come to that.
And it does come to that.
That's the reality of it.
It does come to that, which is why it's so critical that you do this work and that you do the things that you do to investigate, to do everything that you possibly can to find any additional coverage that there may be. You've talked about a couple of different sources of additional coverage. You talked about resident relative. I think you alluded to uninsured motorist, underinsured motorist, business policies, business people that own small businesses. Maybe they have business policies, liability policies, or maybe they have umbrella policies, or those kinds of things. And so really the focus, the question I have is I just want to make it clear that so what you're saying, and what my experience is, if we can't find an additional policy, or if we can't find more coverage or even assets owned by the individual, people are just out of luck.
They're gonna run out. There's gonna be run out of sources to tap into.
So that makes it really important that we find these policies or these assets.
Yes.
Okay. Now, if a person is catastrophically injured and their law firm comes back to them and says, "Hey, we couldn't find, all this person had was $30,000 in coverage, or in another state it might be more or less or whatever, but a small amount of coverage, excuse me, for a catastrophic injury." What questions would that person ask his or her lawyer? To make sure that law firm had done the things that they should do to make sure there's absolutely no chance, or as best you can find, is all practical certainty, there's no other policy or asset available to cover the cost of this.
Good question. And I've never been in that situation to be that client where my attorney calls me and says, "Hey, we've tapped out. We can't find any more policies. There's no assets we can attach liens to." I think if I was in that situation, my first response would be, "Well, what do I do now?" Would probably be from my attorney. What do I do now? How do I recover from this?
So that's a fair question. So if I'm in that situation, if somebody were to ask me, and I have been in that situation, I have been in that situation where a person said, "What do I do now?" And it's a good question, and the answer is, you're just out of luck. And so I think that's an important thing, that what we need to realize. And so I'll tell you what I did in response to that. I remember telling the person, "Okay, what we need to do in the future is advise our clients and advise people that we come in contact with to purchase, going forward, uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage. It's not very expensive, and it protects you in exactly that situation. Somebody hits you or your family on the road, and they only have $30,000 coverage, but you have medical bills and lost income that surpasses that. Uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage will be there for you to at least provide for the financial benefit that you need to get through this situation." So I think that's critical that people need to know. One of the things that I found is a lot of people don't want to tap into that. They're like, "We're not going after my insurance," And so when we find an uninsured motorist policy, what do you tell people if they have that, "Why do you got to go after my insurance? It's the other guy's fault"?
I think the most clear response is that, well, that's what you paid for that for. You invested in that for this type of situation.
For this exact situation.
Let's take advantage of that. You have been paying for this, whether they've had that policy for one premium of a year or 10 years. That's what you paid for. You asked your insurance company to do that for you.
It's like having a homeowner's policy, and a storm comes and a tree branch goes through your living room, and you say, "No, not my insurance company." It's the whole point is the reason you've bought that policy is in case somebody hit you and they didn't have adequate insurance.
Yeah, and I think from my view as the investigator for a law firm, I have felt some of that resistance from clients, the response of, "Hold on, what are you talking about? My insurance? What's going to be the response or the fallout from that?" And I have to explain them. That's why it's there. It's there for that reason.
And so when that happens, then I think they're right to ask questions, and they can ask questions to their lawyer about, okay, well, what does that mean? What's the consequences? What does that look like? How does that work? I think that's something they could ask. But I do think it's important that if a person is in this situation and they're told by their lawyer or their law firm there's inadequate insurance to cover your losses, I think the questions that they probably should consider asking is, well, what kinds of things have you done to verify that that's all the insurance coverage that there is? And I think a good, responsible law firm and a good, responsible lawyer will say, these are the things that we've done. And they include the things that you've just described.
Yeah, and if my reports were reviewed as an investigator, I leave a very obvious and evident trail of how I research policies, how I researched resident relatives, how I researched assets, how I try to put together and confirm people are relatives. I leave a very clear, evident trail. So somebody could explain to a client, here's what happened.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Where is it? Tell me about your background, what your history is, your employment history and training is, and your experiences that's led you to be able to do this work and to do it thoroughly and professionally.
Yeah, so my long-time career, I'm a retired law enforcement officer. I was in law enforcement in Dare County, North Carolina. Spent 28 years doing that. I think the relative part of that is the final 18 years of my career, I was a criminal investigator. Well, this is what I did. I filled in gaps, exploring alternative hypotheses for crimes or something that may have happened, so as not to have any sort of biases of what I think the outcome is going to be. So that has really transitioned nicely over to this, being able to research people, where people come from, where they live, the living situations. I did a lot of that in criminal investigations, particularly in developing suspects. I need to know if I develop a suspect, let's figure out who the suspect is. Let's figure out who they are, what they're about, their background. The same thing kind of applies to here, to doing this.
Well, so when I think about investigator, I usually think about, maybe this dates me, I think about, being out on the Magnum PI, being out on the street talking to people, looking at stuff. And I'm sure there's some of that. We'll get to that in just a minute. But what you're telling me is a big part of this job is actually electronic investigation,
Data collection.
doing research and that kind of stuff.
Data collection, and probably just as important as collecting that data is making that data readable or interpretable. I need, when I would do cases, and during my criminal investigations time, I did everything from property crime to homicides. And one of the biggest challenges was put this together so people understand what it is and where it came from. And I think that is a very important part of what I do with Speaks Law Firm. Yes, I will go find this information and this data, but we need to explain where that came from so we can make sure we're tapping into the right sources and not just throwing things out there to see what happens.
So early in my career, I used to do a lot of criminal defense in state and federal court. We used to have a lot of trials. And one of the things that I always I appreciated about the law enforcement officers that I worked with is their dedication to investigating, but also documenting their files. And you can tell when somebody is a pro, and when they document their files. And I would have to cross-examine them on their documentation. And the best ones would always be very thorough in their documentation, and they would always describe the reason for their need to be thorough. And that is because I know somebody may ask me about this 2 years ago and 2 years from now in court, and it needs to be right, and I need to be able to defend it. And if I don't document it thoroughly, I will never remember it 2 years from now.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's something I carry a lot of cases with Speaks Law Firm right now, and I want to make sure in that exact situation when a case manager or a litigation attorney comes to me 18, 20 months later and says, where did you get this piece of information from? I've already pre-planned for that. It's there. I already documented where it came from, so there's no question. Because databases change over time. And what a database might say today could be different. People change addresses. They change auto policies. Some of that stuff isn't permanently recorded, so let's document that now today.
Well, so that brings me to another thing I wanted to touch base with you about. We talk about the urgency, and people call sometimes and they're like, "Hey, yeah, I'd like to talk to you about this this terrible thing that happened. I was really seriously injured or whatever." And then we say, "Okay, well, we'll be happy to talk to you." Some of them are like, "Well, I can talk to you tomorrow. I can call you back in 6 months. I can call you back, when it's, And we always tell them, you might want to think about that. You can do that. That's your prerogative.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.